At 4 a.m. on the 18th, a general advance was made by the 2D, 5th and 9th Corps, the 6th and 18th supporting in reserve. The ground in front of the points which had been assaulted was thickly strewn with the Federal dead, and the slight trenches, from which they had fought so long and desperately, were filled with the slain there had been no opportunity to bury or remove. A few deserters or prisoners were picked up, and from them Meade learned that Beauregard's whole force had been but 2 divisions, and Wise's brigade, now reduced by heavy losses, but trying to occupy a hastily constructed line a half-mile, more or less, in the rear. This information was conveyed to all the corps commanders, who were ordered to press forward vigorously and overwhelm our lines in their unfinished condition. No army could ask a more favourable chance to destroy its antagonist than was here presented. Their whole army was at hand, and the reinforcement of Longstreet's corps, even now coming to Beauregard, was not over 12,000 men, and was still about 3 to 5 hours away. The little which was accomplished during the whole day is striking evidence of the condition to which the Federal army had now been reduced. At first, much time was lost in driving in our pickets, and in efforts to arrange for simultaneous assaults by the different corps. Meade himself at last fixed upon 12 o'clock, and ordered each corps at that hour to assault with a strong column. By that time Kershaw's division had relieved Johnson's, taking its place in the trenches. Hoke, Wise, and none of the artillery could be relieved until after dark, without unwise exposure of the troops. Field's division took position in the trenches on Kershaw's left, but it did not become engaged. Humphreys states that about midday the Second Corps made 2 assaults, both repulsed with severe loss. Later Meade again ordered assaults by all the corps with their whole force, and at all hazards, and as soon as possible. All the corps assaulted late in the afternoon, and at hours not widely apart. Birney with all his disposable force. Nott from the Hare House, supported by one of Gibbon's brigades, Barlow on Mott's left, but were repulsed with considerable loss. Burnside found the task of driving the enemy, it was but a picket force, out of the railroad cut a formidable one, and, assaulting, established his corps within 100 yards of the enemy's main line. Warren's assault was well made, some of Griffin's men being killed within 20 feet of the enemy's works, but it was no more successful than the others. His losses were very severe. On the right, Martindale advanced and gained some rifle pits, but did not assault the main line. On the Confederate side, the day was not considered a day of battle, but only of demonstrations and reconnaissance. None of our reinforcements were engaged, the only fighting done having been by Hoke's division and Wise's brigade, who, under Beauregard, had already borne the whole brunt of the 4 days and 3 nights. The official diary of Longstreet's corps says of the day, "We arrive in Petersburg, and Kershaw relieves Bushrod Johnson's division, Field taking position on Kershaw's right. A feeble attack is made in the afternoon on Elliott's brigade. No official report is given of any brigade except Haygood's, which describes only skirmishing, and one attempted charge on our extreme left, which never got closer than 250 yards. It was necessary to wait until night before Beauregard's artillery could receive its plaudit of well done, good and faithful servants, and be relieved by the fresh battalions of Longstreet's corps. Of all the moonlight nights I can remember, I recall that Saturday night as perhaps the most brilliant and beautiful. The weather was exceedingly dry, the air perfectly calm, with an exhilarating electrical quality in it. The dust rose with every movement and hung in the air. The whole landscape was bathed and saturated in silver, and sounds were unusually distinct and seemed to be alive and to travel everywhere. It was not a night for sleep in the trenches. There was a great deal to be done at all points, to strengthen and improve them, and every man was personally interested in working at his immediate location. In spite of all pains, the drawing out of old guns and approach of new was attended with sounds which wandered far and with luminous clouds of dust gradually rising in the air. Then the enemy would know we were moving, and there would come crashes of musketry at random and volleys of artillery from their lines. Then our infantry would imagine themselves attacked and would respond in like fashion, and the fire would run along the parapet to right and left and gradually subside for a while, to break out presently somewhere else. I was accompanied by Lieutenant Collard's branch, a Collards of artillery of Beauregard's army, a very competent and gallant officer, unfortunately killed in 1869 by the falling of a bridge near Richmond. Grant did not renew his assaults on the 19th, but expressed himself satisfied that all had been done which was possible, and he now directed that the troops should be put under cover and have some rest. Humphreys writes, "The positions gained by the several corps close against the enemy were entrenched, and the two opposing lines in this part of the ground remained substantially the same in position to the close of the war. In brief review, it must be said that Grant successfully deceived Lee as to his whereabouts for at least 3 days, and thus, at the most critical period of the war, saved himself from a second defeat, more bloody, more signal, and more undeniable than Cold Harbor. For if Beauregard alone, with only 14,000 men, was able to stop Grant's whole army even after being driven by surprise into temporary works, what would Lee and Beauregard together have done from the strong original lines of Petersburg? Grant, personally, was at that period not abstemious, and that his troops knew of it, perhaps sometimes exaggerating facts in speaking of it, was known even to the Confederates from the stories of prisoners captured at Cold Harbor. Such a defeat in case of any disaster, with such rumours afloat, would have cast a baleful backlight over the campaign, even to Spotsylvania and the Wilderness. He was now able to base a quasi-claim to victory in establishing himself within the lines of Petersburg. But all the odium of repeated defeats would have been heaped upon his campaign had it terminated with a final and bloody repulse. All this had been changed by his well-planned and successfully conducted strategy. The position which he had secured was full of great possibilities, as yet not fully comprehended. But already the character of the operations contemplated removed all risk of serious future catastrophe. However bold we might be, however desperately we might fight, we were sure in the end to be worn out. It was only a question of a few months, more or less. We were unable to see it at once. But there soon began to spring up a chain of permanent works, the first of which were built upon our original lines captured by the skirmishers the first afternoon, and those works, impregnable to assault, finally decided our fate, when, on the next March 25th, we put them to the test. Of this period following the battles of Cold Harbor and Petersburg, the future historian may find something to say. By all the rules of statecraft, the time had now arrived to open negotiations for peace. There would no longer be any hope of final success, but there would still be much of blood, of treasure, and of political rights, which might be saved or lost. The time never came again when as favourable terms could have been made as now, for it was the hour of the lowest tide in federal hopes. It remains a fact, however, that for many months, even until the very capture of Richmond, both the Confederate army and the people would have been very loth to recognize that our cause was hopeless. Lee's influence, had he advised it, could have secured acquiescence in surrender, but nothing else would. His confidence in his army, doubtless, for some months, delayed his realization of the approaching end. Even when he foresaw it, his duty to his government as a soldier was paramount, and controlled his course to the very last. And there is this to be said. In every war there are two issues contended for. First is the political principle involved, which with us was the right of secession. The second is prestige or character as a people. Conceding our cause, did we defend it worthily, history and posterity being the judges? We lost the first issue, and the more utterly it was lost, the better it has proved to be, for ourselves, even more than for our adversaries. Without detracting from their merit, but displaying and even enhancing it, we have gained the second by a courage and constancy which could only be fully developed and exhibited under the extreme tests endured, and by the high types of men who became our leaders. Is not that end worthy of the extreme price paid for it, even to the last drop of blood shed at Appomattox? I am sure that to the army, any end but the last ditch would have seemed a breach of faith with the dead we had left upon every battlefield. The Federal casualties for Petersburg and for the campaign are given as follows. June 13th to 18. Killed 1,298, wounded 7,474, missing 1,814, total 10,586. May 5 to June 18th. Killed 8,412, wounded 44,629, missing 9,609, total 62,750. No returns exist for Beauregard's losses, but they have been estimated at killed 500, wounded 2,200, missing 2,000, total 4,700. The losses among the general officers were severe on both sides, being of Confederates, killed 8, wounded 15, captured 2, total 25, and of Federals, killed 6, wounded 8, captured 2, total 16. Chapter 22. The Mine. Our first days in the Petersburg trenches were exceedingly busy ones. From June 19th to 24, a daily entry in my notebook was severe sharpshooting and artillery practice without intermission day or night. Our whole time was spent in improving our lines and getting our batteries protected and with good communications. Never until in this campaign had the enemy used mortar fire in the field, but now Abbott's reserve artillery regiment of 1,700 men brought into use 60 mortars ranging from 24 PR. Cohorns to 10-inch seacoast, which caused us great annoyance as we had to keep our trenches fully manned and had no protection against the dropping shells. Fortunately, I had ordered some mortars constructed in Richmond about 2 weeks before, and they began to arrive on June 24th and were at once brought into use. They were only 12-pounders, but were light and convenient, and at close ranges enabled us to hold our own with less loss than might have been expected. The cannoneers in the batteries, and the infantry in the lines who were exposed to this mortar fire, managed to build little bomb-proofs and a labyrinth of deep and narrow trenches in rear of the lines. Abbott's siege train also included 6 100-pounder and 40 30 PR rifles, besides their regular field artillery. Many of the heavy calibers were mounted on the permanent forts, erected in the outer line already referred to. These constituted a sort of entrenched citadel, consisting of isolated forts connected by infantry parapets with ditches and abatis, and impregnable to any assault. Here a small fraction of the army could securely hold its line for days, and continue to threaten Petersburg, leaving the rest free to extend lines on the south, or to threaten Richmond on the north. Meanwhile, in front, their offensive system of trenches and redans was pushed as close as possible to ours, and we were constantly menaced with assault should we weaken our garrison. One point in our front, called Elliott's Salient, was recognized as particularly weak. The edge of the deep valley of Poor Creek, approximately parallel to our general line of works, here approached within 133 yards of the salient, which was held by Pegram's battery, Elliott's brigade occupying the adjacent lines. Along the near edge of the valley, the enemy built strong rifle pits with elaborate headlogs and loopholes, from which a constant fire was kept up upon our works. In the valley behind was ample room for an unlimited force, which could be collected and massed without our knowledge, and would have but 133 yards to advance under fire to reach our works. We soon managed to place obstructions in front of the parapet at this point, and watched closely, confidently expecting that the enemy would here begin soon to make zigzag approaches as in a siege. On June 22nd, Grant sent Wilson's and Kautz's divisions of cavalry upon a raid against the Lynchburg and Danville railroads. On the same day, the 2nd and 6th Corps were stretched out to the left with the intent of reaching the Weldon RR, and perhaps even to the road to Lynchburg. Lee, advised of this movement, sent A.P. Hill with Wilcox's and Mahone's division, supported by Johnson's, to meet it. With Wilcox's division, he obstructed the advance of the 6th Corps so effectively that it failed to reach even the Weldon Road by at least a mile. With Mahone's and Johnson's divisions, he passed through a gap carelessly left between the 2nd Corps, which was swinging around to its left, and the 6th, which was advancing, and struck Barlow's division of the 2nd in the rear. Barlow's and Gibbon's divisions were both badly defeated, losing 4 guns, which were turned upon the fugitives, several colours, and about 1,700 prisoners. Mott's division was also routed but retreated so precipitately as to lose few prisoners. Hill returned at night to his entrenchments, and the next morning the 2nd Corps reoccupied the lines from which it had been driven, and the 6th Corps formed on its left obliquely toward the Weldon Road. Wilson and Kautz were followed in their raid by W.H.F. Lee's division of cavalry, which, however, was unable to prevent the tearing up of the Lynchburg RR from near Petersburg to Burkeville, and of the Danville Road from Burkeville south to the Staunton River. Here the bridge was defended by local militia who were entrenched with artillery. The river was unfordable, and Lee, attacking in the rear, the Federals decided to rejoin Grant at Petersburg by a circuit to the east. Unfortunately for them, Hampton's and Fitzlee's divisions had just returned from the pursuit of Sheridan's cavalry to Trevilian's Station, where they had had a drawn battle on June 11th and 12. These divisions, aided by W.H.F. Lee's, which had continued in the pursuit, and by 2 brigades of infantry under Mahone, fell upon Wilson and Kautz on the 29th at Reams Station and routed them with the loss of 1,500 killed, wounded, and captured, and all of their artillery, 12 guns, and their wagon train. They finally made their escape across the Blackwater, burning the bridge behind them, and thus cutting off pursuit by Hampton and Lee. They reached the James at Lighthouse Point on July 2nd. They had been absent 10 days, had marched over 300 miles, and torn up 60 miles of railroad. The tracks, however, were soon repaired and traffic restored by all the lines. By the Weldon Road, however, it soon became necessary to halt the trains short of Petersburg and to wagon by a roundabout road into the town. Between July 6th and 9, Grant had found it necessary to send the 3 divisions of the 6th Corps to Washington to oppose Early and Breckinridge. These, whom we saw sent by Lee from Cold Harbor to check Hunter's advance upon Lynchburg, had reached Lynchburg before him. Hunter feared either to attack or to retreat by the way he had come. After a pause of 2 days, he started, on June 19th, through W-Way, via the Great Kanawha, the Ohio River, and the Baltimore and Ohio RR to Harper's Ferry. This left the valley open. Early at once moved down it to demonstrate against Washington. The only force available to oppose him was Wallace's command from Baltimore, with Ricketts's division of the 6th Corps, which was the first to arrive. Early had crossed the Potomac at Shepherdstown and moved through the passes of South Mountain. On July 9th, he attacked and defeated Wallace on the Monocacy. The next day he moved upon Washington, Wallace being driven toward Baltimore. Never before, probably, had Washington been as bare of troops as when Early arrived before it on the afternoon of July 11th. But there were regular garrisons of infantry and artillery at many of the permanent forts, District of Columbia volunteers, regiments of veteran reserves, many miscellaneous detachments at the camp of instruction, and about 2,000 organized employees of the Quartermaster's Department, in all over 20,000 men. These troops alone, without aid, could have defended the city indefinitely and forced Early to undertake a siege. That night there arrived the 2 remaining divisions of the 6th Corps and 6,000 men of the 19th Corps under Emory from New Orleans. In the afternoon, Early had reconnoitred, and in consultation with his officers had ordered an assault in the morning. It is scarcely credible that he would have made more than a demonstration, for any real attack would have been but a bloody farce. In the night he heard of the arrival of the troops, and in the morning could see them. He did not attack, and that night he withdrew, marching to Leesburg, where he recrossed the Potomac. Grant had intended, on Early's repulse, not only to bring back the 6th Corps to Petersburg, but also to bring down the 19th. Had he now carried out those intentions, it is likely that Lee would have brought down Early. It was Lee's policy, however, to fight for time and delay matters by division, rather than to hasten them by concentration. So he left Early in the valley, where his presence would be a constant menace and would neutralize more troops than his equivalent elsewhere. On June 30th, I became convinced that the enemy were preparing to mine our position at the Elliott salient. At that point, incessant fire was kept up by their sharpshooters, while a few hundred yards to the right and left, the fire had been gradually allowed to diminish and men might show themselves without being fired at. That indicated that some operation was going on, and for several days I had expected to see zigzag approaches started on the surface of the ground. When several days had passed and nothing appeared, I became satisfied that their activity was underground. On my way home, I was that day wounded by a sharpshooter and received a furlough of 6 weeks to visit my home in Gay. On my way to the cars next day, I was driven by Lee's headquarters, where I reported my belief about the mine. There happened to be present Mr. Lawley, the English correspondent of the London Times, who was much interested and asked how far it would be necessary to tunnel to get under our works. I answered about 500 feet. He stated that the longest military tunnel or gallery which had ever been run was at the Siege of Delhi, and that it did not exceed 400 feet. That it was found impossible to ventilate for any greater distance. I replied that in the Federal Army were many coal miners who could be relied on to ventilate mines any distance that might be necessary, and it would. Not due to rely upon military precedents, it proved that my suspicion was correct. It was June 30th when I guessed it. The gallery had been commenced on June 27th. It was undertaken in opposition to the advice of all the military engineers at Federal headquarters by Lieutenant Colonel Pleasance of the 48th Para Regiment, a coal miner, who saw the opportunity which the situation offered. A gallery was successfully extended 511 feet, with 2 branch galleries at the end, to the right and left, each 37 feet long. These branch galleries were charged with gunpowder in 8 parcels of 1,000 pounds each, connected by open troughs of powder to be fired by safety fuses coming through the tamping and along the gallery. His method of ventilation was very simple. When the tunnel had penetrated the hill far enough to need it, a close partition was built across it near the entrance with a close-fitting door. Through the partition on the side of this door was passed the open end of a long square box, or closed trough, which was built along on the floor of the tunnel, conveying the fresh outside air to the far end of the tunnel, where the men extending it were at work. To create a draught through this air box, a fireplace was excavated in the side of the tunnel, within the partition, and a chimney was pierced through the hill above it. A small fire in this chimney place, and the outside air would pass through the air box to the far end of the tunnel, whence it would return and escape up the chimney, taking with it the foul air of the tunnel. This tunnel was finished July 17th, the galleries on the 23rd, and the mine was charged and tamped on the 28th. Lee, on receipt of my message on July 1st, ordered our engineers to start countermines at the Elliott salient. 2 shafts were sunk about 10 feet, and listening galleries were run out from each. Unfortunately, the shafts were located on the right and left flanks of the battery, and the enemy's gallery passed at a depth of 20 feet under the apex, and was so silently built that our miners never knew of their proximity. Had they detected it, they would have hastened to explode what is called a camouflet, an undercharged or smothered mine, which does not disturb the surface, but caves in adjacent galleries. By July 10th, our miners had done enough work, had it been done at the apex of the salient, to have heard the enemy, who would have been directly beneath them. Work was not only kept up, however, on the flanks, but at 2 other positions farther to the left, known as Colquitt's and Gracie's salients, countermines were also begun. At Colquitt's on the 10th, and at Gracie's on the 19th. All 4 of our mines were constantly pushed until the 30th, when the explosion occurred, the total length of our galleries being then about 375 feet. Of the 2 galleries on each side of the mine, one, which was unoccupied, was destroyed by the explosion. In the other, the miners were at work, but though much shaken up, the galleries were not crushed, and the miners climbed out and escaped. Meanwhile, in spite of predictions of failure, the mine had been constructed, and though we were known to suspect it, and our countermining operations could be heard, it was now determined to delay the explosion until preparations could be made to have it followed by a grand charge, supported by the concentration of a great force, both of infantry and artillery. That it might be the more effective, Grant determined to combine strategy with main force, and first endeavour to draw a large part of our infantry to the north side of the James. At suitable points, he had already built signal towers overlooking our lines and some of our most important roads, and now the artillery officers were directed to prepare specially to concentrate fire upon every gun in our lines, which could be used for the defence of Elliott's salient. In obedience to these instructions, Humphreys reports, heavy guns and mortars, 81 in all, and about the same number of field guns, were prepared with abundant ammunition. At Deep Bottom, Butler maintained 2 pontoon bridges across the James, with part of the 10th Corps on the north side, under cover of his gunboats and ironclads. Of course, we had to maintain a moderate force in observation, which under General Connor was located near Bailey's Creek. Grant could cross both the Appomattox and the James, and go from his lines around Petersburg to Deep Bottom by a march of 12 miles, all of it entirely concealed from our view. Lee could only send troops to meet him by a march of 20 miles. On the afternoon of July 26th, Hancock, with about 20,000 infantry, and Sheridan with 2 divisions, about 6,000 cavalry, were started to Deep Bottom. It was expected that this force, aided by the 10th Corps, would surprise the Confederate brigade, Connor's, and would then make a dash toward Richmond. Sheridan was directed also to endeavour to cut the railroads north of Richmond. During the night, this force crossed the river, and at dawn on the 27th moved upon our lines and captured 4 20 Parrots in an advanced position. It happened that Lee had noted activity of the enemy in that quarter. Wilcox's division was already at Drury's Bluff, and on the 24th it and Kershaw's division were sent to reinforce Connor. This force made such a show that Hancock, finding it there before him, did not deem it wise to assault their line. On their left, Kershaw even advanced against Sheridan's cavalry and forced it to retreat. It took a position behind a ridge, where it dismounted a considerable force armed with the Spencer magazine carbines. Kershaw unwisely attempted a charge and was quickly repulsed, losing 250 prisoners and 2 colours. On hearing of Hancock's crossing on the morning of the 27th, and that prisoners had been captured from the 2 10th and 18th Corps, Lee immediately sent over W. H. F. Lee's division of cavalry and Heth's infantry of Hill's corps. Later in the day, he arranged to have Field's division of infantry withdrawn from his trenches at dark to follow during the night, and Fitz Lee's cavalry the next morning. President Davis was also advised, and on the 29th the local defence troops in Richmond were called out to the defence of the Richmond lines. These troops were never called out except in the gravest emergencies, which indicates the importance Lee attached to the demonstration. But it was only a demonstration designed to be abandoned if it failed to make a surprise of our lines at Deep Bottom on the 27th. As this became fully apparent on the 28th, orders were issued from Deep Bottom to prepare the mine for explosion on the morning of the 30th. Orders were also given for the 2D Corps with a division of the 18th Corps and one of the 10th to return and take part in the assault. Sheridan's cavalry was also to return, and passing in rear of the army to take position on its left to threaten our extreme right and prevent our reinforcing the vicinity of the mine. The explosion might have been arranged for the afternoon of the 29th, but the morning of the 30th was chosen, as it permitted the placing of more heavy guns and mortars for the bombardment, which would follow the explosion, as well as preliminary arrangements, such as massing the troops, removing parapets and abatis to make passages for the assaulting columns, and the posting of pioneers to remove our abatis and open passages for artillery through our lines. Depots of entrenching tools, with sandbags, gabions, fascines, etc., were established, that lodgements might be more quickly made, though the pioneers of all regiments were already well supplied with tools. Engineer officers were designated to accompany all columns, and even pontoon trains were at hand to bridge the Appomattox in pursuit of fugitives. Finally, Meade personally impressed on every corps commander the importance of celerity of movement. Briefly, no possible precaution was omitted to be carefully ordered, and the success of the Deep Bottom expedition in drawing Lee's forces to that locality had exceeded all expectations. On the morning of the 30th, Lee had left to hold the 10 miles of lines about Petersburg, but 3 divisions, Hoke's, Johnson's, and Mahone's, about 18,000 men, most of the rest of his army being 20 miles away. Hoke and Johnson held from the Appomattox on the left to a little beyond the mine. Mahone held all beyond, one brigade being 4 miles to the right. The 2D, 5th, 9th, and parts of the 10th and 18th, with 2 divisions of Sheridan's cavalry, 16 divisions in all, near 60,000 men, were concentrated to follow up the surprise to be given by the explosion under Johnson's division. That it should be the more complete, for 2 days no heavy guns or mortars had been fired, that the Confederates might believe that the Federals were preparing to retreat. Everything now seemed to be working exactly as Grant would have it, and it is difficult to entirely explain how the attack came to fail so utterly. Several causes cooperated which will be presently referred to, but among them was the same cause which on May 12th nullified the Federal surprise at the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania. Too many troops had been brought together, and they were in each other's way. On a smaller scale, in the assault of Fort Sanders at Knoxville, 3 Confederate brigades got mingled in the assault, which at once lost its vigour, though it did not retreat until after receiving severe punishment. The brigadier in command, on this occasion, ascribed his failure to the presence of the 2 other brigades who should have been upon his flanks. The assault was to be led by Ledley's division of the 9th Corps, a selection made by lot, and a very unfortunate one, as Ledley and Ferrero, who commanded the coloured division, which was to follow Ledley, both took shelter in a bomb-proof, where they remained during the entire action. The mine was ordered to be fired at 3:30 a.m., but the fuses had been spliced, and when first fired, failed at the splice. After an hour, an officer and sergeant entered the tunnel and relighted the fuse. The explosion occurred at 4:40. As the sun rose about 4:50, the delay had been advantageous, as it gave daylight for the movements of the troops and for the artillery fire. The explosion made a crater 150 feet long, 97 feet wide, and 30 feet deep, the contents being hurled so high in the air that the foremost ranks of the assaulting columns, 150 yards away, shrank back in disorder in fear of the falling earth. The bulk of the earth, however, fell immediately around the crater, mingled with the debris of 2 guns, 22 cannoneers, and perhaps 250 infantry, 9 companies of the 19th and 22nd SC, which had been carried up in the air. Quite a number of these who fell safely were dug out and rescued alive by the assaulting column. Some, not yet aroused, were lost, covered up in the bomb-proofs of the adjacent trenches by the falling earth. This formed a high embankment, as it were, all around the crater, with one enormous clod, the size of a small cabin, perched about the middle of the inside rim, which remained a landmark for weeks. A high interior line, called a trench cavalier, had been built across the gorge of the salient enclosing a triangular space, and the left centre of this space about coincided with the centre of the explosion. The parapets were partially destroyed and largely buried by the falling earth. Into this crater the leading division literally swarmed until it was packed about as full as it could hold, and what could not get in there crowded into the adjacent trenches which the falling earth had caused to be vacated for a short distance on each flank. But, considering the surprise, the novelty of the occasion, and the terrific cannonade by 150 guns and mortars which was opened immediately, the coolness and self-possession of the entire brigade was remarkable, and to it is to be attributed the success of the defence. This was conducted principally by Colonel McMaster of the 17th SC, General Elliot having been soon severely wounded. The effect of the artillery cannonade was more a moral effect than a physical one, for the smoke so obscured the view that the fire was largely at random, at least for 1 or 2 hours, during which it was in fullest force. The effort was at once made to collect a small force in the trenches upon each flank, and one in an entrenchment occupying a slight depression which ran parallel to our line of battle some 250 yards in rear of it, the effort being to confine the enemy to the crater and the lines immediately adjoining. The multiplicity of the deep and narrow trenches, and the bomb-proofs in the rear of our lines, doubtless contributed to our success in doing this on the flanks, but there was also decided lack of vigour and enterprise on the part of the enemy, which permitted us to form barricades which were successfully defended to the last. Meanwhile, the reinforcements to the storming column, instead of spreading to the flanks, massed outside of our lines in rear of the storming column, which had made no further advance, but had filled the crater and all the captured lines. Several efforts were made to advance from time to time, but the first were feeble, and could be checked by the remnants of the brigade under McMaster, until 2 regiments of Wise's brigade and 2 of Ransom's were brought up from the left. With their aid, the situation was made safe and held until about 10 a.m., when Mahone arrived at the head of 3 brigades of his corps, drawn from the lines on our right. A regiment of Hoke's from the left also came up later. In the meantime, a few of our guns had found themselves able to fire with great effect upon the enemy massed in front of our lines. The left gun in the next salient to the right, occupied by Davidson's battery, was in an embrasure which flanked the Pegram salient, but was not open to any gun on the enemy's line. This gun did fearful execution, being scarcely 400 yards distant. It was fired by Major Gibbes, commanding the battalion, for perhaps 40 rounds, until he was badly wounded, after which it was served by Collier, Huger and Haskell, Winthrop and Mason of my staff, and later by some of Wise's infantry. A hot fire was turned upon it, but it was well protected, and could never be kept silent when the enemy showed himself. 500 yards to the left was a 4-gun battery under Capty right of Coyt's battalion in a depression behind our line, and masked from the enemy by some trees. But it had a flanking fire on the left of Pegram's salient, and across all the approaches, and a number of infantry of Wise's brigade could also add their fire. Wright's fire was rapid, incessant, and accurate, causing great loss. The Federal artillery made vain efforts to locate him with their mortar shells, which tore up the ground all around, but could never hit him or silence him. Besides these, a half-dozen or more of Cohorn mortars under Cole Haskell, from 2 or 3 different ravines in the rear, threw shell aimed at the crater. And finally, 600 yards directly in rear of the mine was the sunken Jerusalem Plank Road, in which I had placed Haskell's battalion of 16 guns about the 20th of June, and he had been kept there ever since, without showing a gun or throwing up any earth which would disclose his position. He had suffered some loss from random bullets coming over the parapets at the salient 500 yards in front, but it was borne rather than disclose the location. This morning, on one occasion, a charge was attempted by the Coloured Division, part of which was brought out of the crater and started toward the Plank Road. Then Haskell's guns showed themselves and opened fire. The charge was quickly driven back with severe loss among its white officers. A single private with his musket at a support arms made the charge, running all the way to the guns and jumping into the sunken road between them, where he was felled with a rammer staff. Meanwhile, our guns across the Appomattox on the Federal right, and from our left near the river, had kept up a reply to the Federal cannonade to prevent their concentration opposite the mine. Lee and Beauregard had early come to the field, which they surveyed from the windows of the G House, where Johnson made headquarters, on the Jerusalem Plank Road near Haskell's guns. Hill had gone to bring up his troops. On the arrival of Mahone, he at once prepared to attack, and had formed Weisiger's brigade, when a renewed attempt to advance was made from the enemy's lines on our left of the crater. He at once met this by a countercharge of Weisiger's with a portion of Elliott's, which drove the enemy back and which caused the retreat from the rear of their lines of many who had been sheltered within them. These suffered severely by our fire from the flanks as they crossed the open spaces behind, under fire from the guns upon both flanks and infantry as well. This retreat under such severe fire was seen in the Federal lines, just in time to put a stop to an attack upon our right flank, about to be made by Ayres's division of Warren's corps, which had been ordered to capture the one-gun battery on our right, as they called the one at which Gibbies had been wounded. There was very little infantry supporting this gun, or able to reach it without exposure. Ayres's attack would probably have been successful. He was about to go forward when Meade directed all offensive operations to cease. Wright's brigade arriving about 11:30, Mahone made a second attack, which was repulsed with the aid of the Federal artillery bearing upon the ground. Between 1 and 2 p.m., Sanders's brigade having arrived, and also the 61st NC from Hoke, a combined movement upon both flanks of the crater was organised. Mahone attacked on the left with Sanders's brigade, the 61st NC and the 17th SC. Johnson attacked on the right with the 23rd SC and the remaining 5 companies of the 22nd, all that could be promptly collected on that flank. This attack was easily successful. Mahone has stated that the number of prisoners taken in the crater was 1,101, including 2 brigade commanders, Bartlett and Marshall. The tabular statement of the medical department gives the Federal casualties of the day as killed 419, wounded 1679, missing 1910, total 4,008. Elliott's brigade reported the loss by the explosion as. Including these, Johnson reports the casualties in his division, Elliott, Wise, Ransom, Gracie, as follows. Killed 165, wounded 415, missing 369, total 938. There are no returns for Mahone's and Hoke's divisions. Hoke's division was composed of Corse's, Klingman's, Fulton's, Haygood's and Colquitt's brigades, and Mahone's had only 3 brigades on the field, Weisiger's, Wright's and Sanders's. Of these 8 brigades, only Weisiger's had serious losses, but there are no reports except for Colquitt's, who, like the rest of Hoke's division, held a portion of the line not attacked. His casualties were 4 killed and 27 wounded. The total Confederate loss is given in the tabular statement of the medical department as 400 killed, 600 wounded, and 200 missing, which is perhaps between 200 and 300 too small. The military court censured Gens, Burnside, Ledley, Ferrero, Wilcox, and Colin Bliss, commanding a brigade. They also expressed their opinion that explicit orders should have been given assigning 1 officer to the command of all the troops intended to engage in the assault when the commanding general was not present in person to witness the operations. There is nothing in the reports to explain this. Grant sent a despatch to Halleck at 10 a.m., saying that he was just from the front, and about that time Humphreys reports that Meade, with Grant's concurrence, ordered the cessation of all offensive movements. Chapter 23. The Fall of 1864. General Humphreys writes of the situation in August, soon after the fiasco of the mine, as follows. Between this time and the month of March, 1865, several movements of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James were made to the right and to the left, which resulted in the extension of our line of entrenchments in both directions, and caused a corresponding extension of the Confederate entrenchments on our left, and their occupation in stronger force of their entrenchments on the north bank of the James. By this process their lines finally became so thinly manned, when the last movement to our left was made in March 1865, as to be vulnerable at 1 or 2 points, where some of the obstructions in their front had been in a great measure destroyed by the exigencies of the winter. In other words, attacks upon our lines were now abandoned for a succession of feints, first upon one flank and then upon the other, by which our lines were extended at both ends to the point of breaking. This point was reached in 8 months at 1 or 2 places, where the Confederates had been tempted by the severity of the winter to burn the abatis in front of their breastworks. We will not attempt to follow either these efforts of the enemy or Lee's aggressive counter-movements, of which there was no lack, though all were attended with much hard fighting. Besides the heavy casualties of these incessant affairs, which followed each other at short intervals from August 1st to November 1st, There was daily sharpshooting and much mortar and artillery practice, which helped swell the totals. Confederate reports are entirely lacking, but losses were fully as heavy in proportion to the numbers engaged, as were the Federal losses. For on several occasions Lee was the aggressor and lost heavily. On October 7th, on the Darbytown Road, Field's division was sent to charge 2 brigades in breastworks, which proved to be armed with the Spencer magazine guns. He was quickly repulsed with severe loss, which included Gregg of Texas killed and Bratton of SC wounded. The total Federal casualties for this period, August 1st to December 31st, are given as killed 21 to 72, wounded 11,138, missing 11,311, total 24,621. The corresponding Confederate losses were probably between 12,000 and 14,000. It will afford a better view of the situation as a whole to glance at those events referred to by Swinton, where he says, "Had not success elsewhere come to brighten the horizon, it would have been difficult to raise new forces to recruit the Army of the Potomac." The first and most important of the events resulting in success elsewhere was President Davis relieving Joseph E. Johnston of the command of the army opposing Sherman at Atlanta, and appointing Hood to succeed him. This step was taken with great reluctance and under great popular and political pressure brought by Governor Brown and Sendon Hill of Gay, who claimed that Johnston intended to surrender Atlanta without giving battle. After many reiterations of such charges, Davis was at length led to give a promise to relieve Johnston if, on being asked for some assurance of his intention to fight, he failed to give it. General Bragg was sent to interview him, and after spending 2 days with him, wired, "He has not sought my advice, and it was not volunteered. I cannot learn that he has any more plan in the future than he has had in the past." Davis then wired to Johnston a direct inquiry as follows: "I wish to hear from you as to present situation and your plan of operations, so specifically as will enable me to anticipate events." This was sent July 16th, and Johnston replied the same day. "As the enemy has double our number, we must be on the defensive. My plan of operations must therefore depend upon that of the enemy. It is mainly to watch for an opportunity to fight to advantage. We are trying to put Atlanta into condition to be held for a day or two by the Gay militia, that army movements may be freer and wider." This reply was certainly not specific and was considered evasive. It will be remembered that in April 1862, the relations between the President and Johnston had been strained to the verge of breaking by the general's reticence as to his plans and avoidance of interviews, even by galloping to the front on seeing the President approach near the field of 7 Pines. There a crisis was avoided by Johnston's wound and loss of the command of the army. Now a very similar issue had arisen, and with it the old and bitter feelings on each side. On the 17th, Adjutant General Cooper wired Johnson, "I am directed by the Secretary of War to inform you that as you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta, and express no confidence that you can defeat or repel him, you are hereby relieved from the command of the Army and Department of the 10, which you will immediately turn over to General Hood." To this Johnston replied that the order had been received and obeyed, and added, "As to the alleged cause of my removal, I assert that Sherman's army is much stronger, compared with that of 10, than Grant's compared with that of Northern VA. Yet the enemy has been compelled to advance much more slowly to the vicinity of Atlanta than to that of Richmond and Petersburg, and penetrated much deeper into Var than into Gay. Confident language by a military commander is not usually regarded as evidence of competence. It is vain to speculate on what might have happened had Johnston been left in command. Had Lee been commander-in-chief, he would not have been relieved, as was indicated by his restoring Johnston to command on his taking that position in February. But it is a fact that Johnston had never fought but one aggressive battle, the Battle of 7 Pines, which was phenomenally mismanaged. On the 20th and 21st, Hood attacked Sherman, but was defeated, and after a month of minor operations was finally, on September 1st, compelled to evacuate Atlanta. Meanwhile, a naval expedition sent under Farragut against Mobile had captured the forts commanding the harbour of that city on August 23rd. These two events, the capture of Mobile and Atlanta, following each other within a few days, came at perhaps the period of the greatest political depression of the administration. On August 23rd, Mr. Lincoln had written on a slip of paper, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterward." This paper he folded and had the cabinet put their names on its back. The victories came like an interposition of Providence and proved to be the final turning of the balance in the federal favour. The Democratic Party had nominated McClellan on a peace platform, mistaking the general discontent and depression for a desire for peace at any price. McClellan himself had repudiated the platform, but, as victory now seemed inclining to the federal banners, all opposition to the administration died out. At the election in November, Mr. Lincoln received 212 electoral votes and McClellan but 21. The attacks which Hood had made upon Sherman on the 20th and 22nd had both been judiciously planned and had stood excellent chances of success. The failure in both cases was from want of strict compliance with orders on the part of one of his corps commanders, Jenon Hardy. To trace it further would bring it home to himself for failure to supervise the execution of important orders, a sort of failure from which even the most eminent commanders have never been exempt. Another and striking example of it attended Hood's next campaign, this time involving practically a death blow to his army. Having manoeuvred to draw Sherman out of entrenchments at Atlanta by moving upon his communications, he succeeded in drawing him as far north as Dalton, and then crossed into Alabama at Gadsden, where he arrived October 20th. Here he had hoped to deliver battle, but Sherman declined to follow and returned to Atlanta, making preparations for the march to Savannah, upon which he set out November 15th. In this event, Hood's orders from the President were to follow Sherman and hang upon his rear. But, with the approval of Beauregard, who had been placed in command of the department, Hood decided, instead, to advance upon Nashville, where Thomas commanded with an inferior force under Schofield, holding the country to the south. President Davis had not imagined that any demonstration Hood could possibly make upon Nashville would be seriously regarded by Grant. The result, however, proved that it was thought to threaten Kai, and it was considered of such grave importance that Grant had threatened to relieve Thomas for delay in attacking Hood. Grant was actually on his way to Nashville, perhaps to do this, when Thomas won his victory. So much in explanation of Hood's campaign. The issue at stake was now lost by the non-compliance with orders of General Cheatham, commanding one of Hood's corps. Schofield had taken position on the north side of Duck River, opposing Hood's crossing. Hood led Lee's corps to demonstrate against Schofield, while he threw a pontoon bridge across the river 3 miles above and crossed Cheatham's and Stuart's corps, which marched to Spring Hill on the Franklin Pike, 12 miles in Schofield's rear, arriving about 3 p.m. This place was held by the 2D Division of the 4th Corps, about 4,000 strong. Hood's force was about 18,000 infantry. Hood took Cheatham with Cleburne, a division commander, within sight of the pike, along which the enemy could now be seen retreating at double quick, with wagons in a trot, and gave explicit orders for an immediate attack and occupation of the pike. Similar orders, too, were given to Stuart's corps, and when Hood found later that nothing was being done, he sent more messages by staff officers, which also failed of effect. The head of Schofield's infantry arrived about 9 o'clock and passed unmolested, except by some random picket shots to which they made no reply. Both Confederate divisions had bivouacked within gunshot of the pike, but no effort was made to occupy it or to cross it. Undoubtedly, here Hood should have ridden to the front and led the troops into action himself. In his book, he calls the opportunity the best move in my career as a soldier. A few days after, Cheatham frankly admitted his delinquency. It was rumoured that both he and Jenner Stewart had that evening absented themselves from their divisions. Both had been often distinguished for gallantry, and Hood now overlooked it, believing it had been a lesson not to be forgotten. Nevertheless, it proved the death blow to Hood's army. On the next day, Schofield took a strong position at Franklin for the protection of his wagon trains, resting both flanks on the Harpeth River across a concave bend. His entrenched main line was but a mile in length. It was well protected with abattis, and 280 yards in front, an entire division, Wagner's of the 4th Corps, held an advanced line, with its flanks drawn back nearly to the main line, and also well protected by abattis. His infantry, about 23,000, was a little more than Hood's, and was ample to man both lines, and to hold a strong reserve in a well-sheltered position close in the rear. One of his infantry brigades, Casements, was armed with magazine breech-loaders. The ground in front was mostly level and open pasture land, and batteries across the Harpeth could fire upon the approaches. To assault was a terrible proposition to troops who, during Johnston's long retreat, had been trained to avoid charging breastworks. But Hood saw no alternative, since he had lost the one opportunity of the campaign at Spring Hill the night before. For Schofield was now within a day's march of Nashville. He ordered the attack, and for the credit of his army it must be said that officers and men responded valiantly, and went down to defeat in a blaze of glory. Over 10% of the force engaged were killed outright on the field, over 20% were carried to hospitals with severe wounds, and as many more suffered less severe wounds or were captured. The loss of general officers was unparalleled on either side in any action of the war. Cleburne, Gist, Adams, Strahl and Granbury were killed. Brown, Carter, Manigault, Qualls, Cockrell and Scott were wounded, and Gordon was captured. 53 regimental commanders were killed, wounded or captured. The result might have been different, but for 3 handicaps. 1. Hood, most unwisely, did not precede his charge with a severe cannonade, because the village of Franklin was but a half-mile in rear of his line. The enemy's position was quite crowded, and all his lines were subject to enfilade. It would have severely shaken the enemy, and with little danger to non-combatants, which they could not avoid. 2. The action was not begun until 4 p.m. The sun set at 4:50 p.m., and darkness prevented Hood from getting in 2 of Lee's divisions. There was no moon. 3. The presence on the field of Casement's brigade with magazine breech-loaders. It was said by a correspondent that never before had men been killed so fast as they were during this charge by the fire of this brigade. The action was hand-to-hand all along the enemy's main line. It was carried for quite a space at one point, but was restored by a charge of the reserve. At some points men were dragged across the parapets and captured. The battle continued with violence until 9 p.m, and firing was kept up until 3 a.m, when the enemy withdrew from the field, leaving his dead and wounded. Schofield's losses were killed 189, wounded 1033, missing 1104, total 2326. Hood left 1750 dead on the field and 3,800 in hospitals. The slightly wounded and prisoners were about 2,000. His losses in the Battle of Franklin made it impossible for Hood to attack at Nashville, but he hoped to fortify and threaten until he was attacked, and then to gain a victory. What a vain hope! Efforts were being made to bring troops from Texas across the Mississippi, which also, of course, proved vain. They never even started. His force was now reduced to about 18,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, with which he took position before Nashville on December 2nd. Here he entrenched himself and awaited Thomas's attack, which the latter delayed until December 15th. By this date he had accumulated a force of over 53,000 men. With these he attacked on the 15th, but with little success and with severe losses at points where he assailed Hood's entrenchments. On the 15th the Federals renewed their assaults and during the morning were again repulsed. About 3 p.m. they massed a large force under cover behind a hill about Hood's left centre and under cover of a heavy. Ree of artillery made a gallant charge and carried Hood's line, which, seeing the disaster, broke in all directions, and all efforts to rally it failed. During the night, Hood withdrew, losing 54 guns and 4,500 prisoners. There was no return made of his casualties, but he reported them as very small. Thomas reported, killed 387, wounded 2562, missing 112, total 3061. Hood made good his retreat to Tupelo Miss, where his army rested for reorganization on Jan. 10, 1865. In the spring it was transferred to NC, where it served under A.P. Stewart, and about 7,000 strong was included in Johnston's surrender. The Battle of Franklin had proved its death blow. Besides the loss of Atlanta and the destruction of Hood's army, there remains a third sequence of the change of commanders which deserves notice among the successes elsewhere, preparing the ground for Grant when he again became able to inaugurate a campaign. This was the unopposed march of Sherman from Atlanta to Savannah between November 15 and December 25, with the capture of Savannah on the latter date. It was preceded by the deliberate burning of every house in Atlanta. Not a single one was spared, not even a church. This was excused on the ground that war is hell. It depends somewhat upon the warrior. The conduct of Lee's army in Parr presents a pleasing contrast. It had been hoped that the few troops which could be gathered in Guyay, aided by the militia of the state and by 13 brigades of Confederate cavalry under Wheeler, might effectively harass and delay such a march, but all such expectations proved utterly vain. Though little was said in the press at the time, and our public speakers belittled the achievement, there is no question that the moral effect of this march upon the country at large, both at the north and the south, and also upon foreign nations, was greater than would have been the most decided victory. Already it cast the ominous shadow of Sherman's advance up the coast in the coming spring. In this connection, there now began demonstrations against Wilmington, which was the last port of the Confederacy holding out opportunities to blockade runners. These came in under the protection of Fort Fisher at the mouth of the river 20 miles below the city. The fort was a formidable one, mounting 44 guns, and had a garrison of 1,400 men under Cole and Lamb. A military and naval expedition set out against it on December 13, 1864, under General Butler and Adiem. Porter in a fleet of 50 war vessels and 100 transports carrying 6,500 infantry. The fleet was the largest ever assembled under the Federal flag, and it had been specially intended by Grant that the infantry force should be commanded by General Weitzel. It was never contemplated that Butler should even accompany it. In the expressive language of modern slang, he had not only butted in and had taken the command from Weitzel, but had devised a new mode of attack upon Fort Fisher. This was to be a disguised blockade runner loaded with 215 tons of gunpowder to be run at night close to Fort Fisher and exploded. It was supposed that this would put the whole fort hors de combat. General Delafield, chief engineer, submitted to the War Department a report on destructive effects of explosions of gunpowder in open air, indicating their very limited range. Butler was notoriously a military charlatan, who had been forced upon Grant as commander of the Army of the James by political considerations. During all the summer campaign, he knew and felt his importance, and had been able even successfully to bully Grant himself, who was already under sharp criticism for his terrible losses in battle and for the rumours in the army of his intemperance. Early in July, after some preliminary correspondence indicating a doubt how Butler would relish any interference with himself, Halleck issued an order assigning the troops under him to the command of W.F. Smith and sending Butler to Fortress Monroe. On receipt of this order, he said to his staff, who were near, "Gentlemen, this order will be revoked tomorrow." The next day, clad in full uniform, he called at Grant's headquarters, where he found Mr. Dana, Ast. Sequence of War. General James H. Wilson, in a memoir on the life and services of W.F. Smith, gives the following account of the interview. Sir,